Oh yeah, here we go. Practice acquisition.
I love when either the buyer or the seller think that they can get through this process on their own.
There are pitfalls throughout the entire process. I have seen a ton of these deals. If you want to buy a practice, this is how, folks.
Acquisition Uncensored, the truth when buying and selling a dental practice. And now your hosts, Michael Dincio and John Bertagni.
All right, here we go. Dental Acquisition Uncensored, Season 2. John Bertagni, Mike Dincio here. Thanks so much for being a part of our program. I'm really excited about Dr. Cindy Pauley. She brings a lot to the table, and this is just one of those pieces that we will be filling in for you as we go through the journey. So, John, what are you excited about today?
What I'm excited is her experience, right? She's bought, her family, her and her husband have bought, sold, and bought practices and throughout that process. So what we have to understand is she's going to give an incredible perspective from her mind, her psyche going into it, her staff, making sure they're good, any issues that they might, or pitfalls. That's the main thing that we want to focus on here. And she brings an amazing experience that we want our buyers to understand on that sell side so they can bridge the gap at that closing table.
Yeah, pay attention. So many goodies in this episode. Remember, follow us, get on Facebook, interact with us. We've got all kinds of amazing people this season. I'm super excited about it. With no further ado, let's bring her in. All right. Welcome. Season 2, Dental Acquisition Uncensored. I gotta get used to that rolling off the tongue, John. We're in Season 2, and I know I'm gonna screw up by saying Startup Uncensored at one point. So when that happens, yeah, make sure you call me out. All right. Mike Dincio here with the show. We're super excited. Founder of Next Level Consultants, and as always, my friend and partner in crime, John Bertagni. Thanks for joining the show, brother.
Thank you. This is fun. This is a new frontier, but it gives a different perspective to our listeners and people that are out there that were thinking about, okay, do I have to do a startup or do I buy a practice? And what does that look like from an economic standpoint, from a feasibility standpoint, but also, from a headache standpoint? There's all different headaches. And as always, when we go through this process, we bring in great references and people that have been through it, whether it's doctors or industry experts. And today we happen to have a doctor that went through this, Cindy Pauley. Hello, Cindy. How are you?
Oh, good. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for joining us. But Cindy went through the process, and our game plan here is to kind of pick her brain to get an understanding of her mindset, how it shifted when she was the seller in the practice. But we want to give that perspective for people to understand that psyche, because Mike, this is not a land grab and fight. This should be something that our listeners, if they're going through this process, that it's a fun transition.
Yeah.
And everything's out on the table. I call it fair exchange. And I learned that from a mentor of mine.
I think that will be the theme of this entire season is there has to be a win-win, buyer and seller, on every deal. There can't be a lose-win, and anybody going into the transition, and Dr. Pauley will probably get into some of this as she, went through the process. But it just can't be. There's got to be a win-win, and that's the whole theme of this show, is really to help buyers go through that process with a level head. And I think as a consultant, half my job is making sure that client does keep a level head through the whole process, and oftentimes the practice brokers will help the sellers keep a level head, and we could get into that too. So So let's get Dr. Pauley here. Cindy, do you mind if we call you Cindy? Is that okay for the show?
That's great. Yeah, that's
Perfect. So, Doc, give us what you're doing today, just real quick, 2-minute. What's your story? Tell us about you and your journey through this whole dentistry. Then you sold your practice and what you're doing today.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is really fun, and I'm excited to be a part of your broadcast. I watched many of your episodes last season. They were really well done, and so it's really fun to be today. So thanks for having me as a guest. I really appreciate it. I was a private practice dentist for 28 years. I practiced first with my mom, who established a practice in Bellevue, Washington, and then my husband is also a dentist. He had an independent practice in another town called Edmonds. And about a little over a decade ago, my mom retired. My husband sold. So that was our first sale of a practice. We sold the practice in Edmonds, and then he took over her part of our practice in Bellevue, which I always refer to as a tandem bike. I really couldn't run it alone, and we had little kids, so I didn't want an associate. So long story short, he came and we worked together for the next 10 years. And, but the first sale that we went through was at that point, him selling a really nice practice in Edmonds, and sort of that process and what that looked like. And then, it came to a point in our career where we had, done other things. Done other investments, and we just decided to pursue those and to go ahead and sell our, dental practice, not the building.
Let me ask you a question, Cindy.
Yeah.
Hang on a second. Because he sold a practice, right? And then did he buy into the practice?
My mom sell him her practice? Yes.
All right. So there it was, right? So there was a sale, buy, and then a sale again. So this is really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had no idea you had that many transitions in your career already. Yeah. And we haven't even talked about yours yet. So
yeah. So it was very positive, obviously very easy because of the fact that he was able to. That practice was, in a nice area, and it sold well. It was well positioned. He was a young dentist, so it wasn't I'm sure you'll go into that, how practices age, and that becomes a little more challenging. But he was sort of at the peak of his career, so it was a very desirable practice. And he was able to pick the buyer that he wanted. He had quite an array of buyers to choose from. So that was nice. And I think he picked a nice fit for his practice. So that really was a nice transition. And then fast forward, then we sold, I think, a little more challenging practice to sell. It was a really big show in this area. It was my husband and myself. It was 3 hygienists. It was CEREC. It was just a big production. It was a big show. And so we needed to find maybe a little less traditional buyer. Yeah. And we ended up selling to a really nice, actually, husband and wife. So it fit us perfectly, very similar to us in practice philosophies and all of that. So it did transition very well.
Let's get into that. Actually, okay. that walks me right into my first question. What, Doc, going into you had some experience up to selling your practice. What were your expectations going into it? That it was going to be easy or hard for you, and you knew this was going to be your final sale, you were done with the game, right?
Yeah, I did. I felt very done. I mean, one thing about being a dentist who sells a practice, and this is probably, I like to say what I think I know or learned, is when we're selling a practice, we're not selling. We're selling our goodwill, and we're selling that area that we've developed. There's usually a covenant not to compete and all of those things that interact. But it's not as scary as, say, your whole family is invested in a widget business, and now you sell the widget business and you are out of business, because without that business, you don't make widgets. You still walk away with your dental degree. So it's not as terrifying, because you sell the practice that you're ready to sell, but you always think in the back of your head, if I have to, I can do this in another place, in another space, whatever the covenant not to compete is. I won't bother these people, but I'll do this. So it's a really safe feeling. I never was scared. We both thought we can always do this in another capacity. We could, go somewhere else, maybe buy a smaller practice, something like that. So we never did, but at that point in time, we were done. Yeah, we were very done. We were physically done. My neck.
Yeah, I mean,
that hurt every day. My husband had a thumb problem. We could have muscled it out for another 10, 15 years, but we felt pretty done.
And I mean, that's something that happens. And you know, I'm gonna
recap a couple pieces of what you kind of talked about, so our listeners can kind of understand how to, you know, dilute this information into something that they could actually drink. But you know, sometimes those larger practices, let's dissect a couple of the things that you talked about. Those larger practices are harder to find individuals.
Yeah.
Not only from philosophically, right? But can they actually do the workload? Because banks look at that and say, can they actually do that work, right? And then a young dentist probably can't buy a $3 million practice right out of school. So they're off the table. Mm-hmm. So these practices, it keeps on getting funneled down. And, you know, as our listeners know, I ran an M&A firm out of Chicago that did healthcare M&A, specifically dentists. And we did large groups a lot of times. That was my focus. And those have very finite end users that they can sell to.
Yeah.
So sometimes that sale process is longer.
Yeah.
So that expectation that you had of, I was done, sometimes people say, hey, I'm going to sell this right away and I'm out of this picture. Guess what? Finding that right buyer sometimes can take a little bit longer, and that process takes a little bit longer. So from our listener standpoint, the buyer, they have to understand the psyche of the seller, right? Mm-hmm. And what their needs are and what is happening with them, because they have to figure out philosophically, treatment plan wise, economically, what this transition is going to look like on both sides.
And I think we're going to, I think through the season, we're going to hope, or I hope we hit that 17 times in every single episode.
Well, that's why I'm bringing it up like early on, because she brought this up in her soliloquy to start.
Yeah.
Come on. She just nailed all of these points.
Yeah.
So the question is, and I always said, yes, you know, I was president of that firm, but more than that, I think I was a psychologist for the dentist that was selling. That psychology that, you know, that I was to these sellers, did you use a broker in your process, or did you do it on your own? Transition one, transition two.
Both of them, we use brokers, and both of them different brokerage houses.
Gotcha.
Ooh, this is good. This is good. So we're going to go into Shark Week with all the practice brokers. And Cindy, now you represent a brokerage, and we're going to interview your firm later on in the season. But so you used multiple brokers.
Well, one for Brian's and then my husband.
Yeah.
One for ours in my situation. Yeah.
Okay. So
some of that was a little bit more nuanced in the sense that I was going to pony back to the idea of what I love saying what I learned as a broker as opposed to what I knew then. And what I learned as a broker that kind of amazed me. And I think as dentists, we're very self-centered. I mean, I think you guys recognize that we live in this very insular orbit where, you know, we write the paychecks for everyone around us, and the patients that come to us generally like us for the most part, and the ones that don't leave. And so we start to get very, yeah, right. We're like, you know, we start to lose a little bit of maybe even understanding. And so we just think the whole world kind of works like us, you know, everyone's going to do it the way we do it. So my husband had walked away from his practice, you know, and turnkey and left, you know, he left on Thursday and the dentist took over on Monday. And that's absolutely the expectation we had in our practice. What I've been surprised by as a broker is how many dentists don't necessarily want to fully retire. They want to sell the practice, the business end of it, and they don't want to work as much, but they definitely want to keep working. And to be honest, that just was like, what? Because the business end of it and the running the business, that was never as much of a burden to me as the 4 days a week of physical dentistry. So, but that's my perspective.
Yeah.
that's not, and I had a husband to help me run a practice, and I always had parents to help me run the practice before that. So the business end of it was not a problem. The physical part of it was a problem. So
see, that's the opposite of what in my experience, not the working back part. I agree. I think to me, that's a lot of eating, having your cake and eating it too, because running the business and managing people is the hard part that all of our clients have challenges with. So why wouldn't they want to just hang out, do some crowns, make some money, and not deal with that crap? Why wouldn't they? And by the way, get a check for selling this amazing practice. And so, doctor, you're
a little more out. I mean, many people do want to walk away, but a lot of people don't. And that was, for whatever it's worth, these are all things that I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. You want to hang around, let someone else manage everything.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
I'm a little bit of a control freak. That would not have worked well with my personality. So there's no way I would have hung around.
That whole world, that whole world that you're thinking about is, why Wall Street is coming in at 25-30% of the market owning dental practices, because they're, whether they like it or not. My dad was a dentist, as the listeners know. He was a horrible business guy, right? He was an amazing dentist, and that's why people like to hand over those keys to these Wall Street and Harvard grads that can run a business really, really well. And that also is the impetus of these doctors saying, hey, I want to stay on for 2-3 years, maybe 5 years. You guys run it, I get a paycheck. That wasn't your world, but a lot of times this actually happens.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And people really, and sometimes it's hard, because if you have a practice, if you're selling a practice that's really a one doctor practice and really only has enough patients for one doctor schedule, that's a challenge, because they need to pay their bank loan back. They can't afford an associate at that point.
Yeah. So those expectations of those buyers, that has to be set up well in advance with that LOI, distinct timeframes that doctors are going to be there, distinct timeframes of, how many days a week they're going to work, and then when they're gone, and with a clause that states, upon a mutually agreed upon or agreed upon timeframe, I can give you notice on both sides. But I do want to get back to this, because that's part of that LOI piece. I asked about 8 minutes ago, did you use a broker? Right. I want to understand why you use 2 different brokers.
Before you answer that, can you pull some pieces out about what worked well and what didn't? You don't have to talk about which broker or whatever. Yeah, I'm really interested in like why it helped, why it didn't help. Like, get into some of that, because selfish plug, you're a broker now, but forget that part. I'm just simply saying, like, there's a lot of value having brokers involved. There is some value in not. And it's usually monetarily for the seller. I just want to break that down just a little bit, maybe in this segment. Yeah.
Sure. So I will tell you that both brokerage situations were just great. So there's no, I don't have any complaints about either situation. I would tell you that I cannot imagine going through either transition without a broker. No. Part of the reason why I'm doing what I do now is I recognized that it was a skill set. I did not in any way understand how complicated it is to be a broker until I became one. I did not understand what they were doing completely. I knew it was important. I knew that I had my dentistry to do. I knew that I had my world to take care of. I did not have contact with banks. There's a laundry list of things that a broker does that I cannot in my head, truthfully, even imagine doing as a dentist. So I'm not exactly sure how. Now, I'm not saying if you sold to, your associate, or if you sold to someone that you already knew, but just a blanket sale of a stranger dentist who you've never met, to come in and purchase your practice. The laundry list of things to do is so enormous that I could never imagine having sold that without a broker. And I would say that both brokers did a great job. I think they were both really professional, and both of our experiences were really positive.
I started this.
One slight difference, but that's it.
Well, still staying on the same vein, I said in the beginning of the show that both sides need to stay very even keel and need to keep their expectations in line and have the appropriate things done, and both sides have their role. And so now, as a buyer's rep on the buyer side, having someone in your corner all the way through from start to finish on both sides, it just makes the deal so much smoother. So did you have a point that you were adding to that? I cut you off, Doc.
No, I think that actually, so we worked with the brokers, but we didn't work with a buyer's representative. And the reason we didn't do that is a lack of knowledge. So I just really want to emphasize that if there was a mistake to make and if there was an error to take, I feel like we did that. So I feel like there was a lack of preparedness. There was a lack of understanding of the process.
It's a whole new concept. I mean, the market doesn't even know how to handle a buyer's rep now. But if you selfish plug, you think about real estate every single day, there's a buyer's rep, and that makes total sense. And so the buyers come in on Dental Town and listening to podcasts like this, and they just have their preconceived ideas about what this process is going to be, and it's all wrong, quite frankly. And then they have bankers' perspectives and attorneys' perspectives and CPAs' perspectives, which are all good perspectives. We're going to interview all these people, but they all kind of are coming from an angle, if that makes sense, and no one's sitting in the shoes of that doctor.
And it's the angle that's fulfilling their box
that they live in. So from an underwriting standpoint, that banker is going to tell that seller this of what needs, your world needs to look like, and buyer, hey, this doesn't fit our world. So that seller then has this, or that buyer has this idea of, oh my God, something's wrong with this practice.
Right.
But in reality, nothing's wrong with the practice. It could be the underwriting box that the bank fits within. It could be, there's so many levels of true understanding of buying a practice and selling a practice that it is insanity.
Yeah.
And in controlling all of those people as a dentist on the buy side and the sell side, that doesn't necessarily fit their train of thought, in my mind.
Totally.
It didn't fit my dad's train of thought when he sold his practice to his associate. His mind was, very proud of what this is, and these are all my friends, and can this guy do what he's going to do when he takes over? Thankfully, he's an amazing dentist and he was able to do it. But there is a psychological, ego that is surrounded on the seller side, that the buyer, in some senses, has to pay deference to what they've built.
Yeah.
They're essentially buying profitability. That's insane. Like that's how the seller or the buyer has to look at this. Like, this person built this behemoth. I need to pay deference for what they're doing. I need to pay a fair price. And that seller has to say, well, I need to make sure, there is some goodwill, there's some tangible assets, and this needs to make sense for them. I think that's the overall piece.
Yeah. I wanted to ask Cindy, during the negotiation process as a seller, okay, was that a frustrating thing for you? John kind of touched on it as like the seller feels like they created this business, the goodwill's theirs, it's their baby. I hear that all the time, right? And they think it's worth X, whatever, right? And then you got
their practice is how very different from.
Yeah.
I laugh all the time with Rod, my boss, and say, "Oh my gosh, I said that. I actually told you what now I hear so much. Yeah. It's like, yeah. And I
So was that hard?
Yeah. I think one problem we have as dentists, and I can be very self-critical, is that we don't recognize that this is done over and over and over in every state, in every place in this country, in the world. I don't know if obviously they don't all operate quite the way ours do always in every country, but we are not that unique. I mean, we have unique practice in that it's in a unique location. It's certainly in one facility and all of those things, but we are not as, and I don't mean this to be negative, I mean it more to be positive. We're not as unique as we think. Therefore, there is a buyer for our practice. There's going to be someone who's interested, and they are going to be successful. And one thing that I like to say, to let people know, is that your patients love you. They do love you. They trust you and they love you. And that's part of what you're selling, your goodwill. And at the end of the day, they will miss you, but they will learn to love the next dentist. So your practice is very saleable. It is okay for you to go. And then you will be surprised that they will never forget you, but move along. And so I think that's something that is hard in the beginning. It is something that you feel like you're very, like you say, everyone says it's their baby. They're very protective, and you should be proud of what you've built, whatever that value is that you're selling. I mean, how blessed are we to be able to sell that? I think one of the reasons on the second transition I was more prepared to be replaced was because I saw how quickly my husband was replaced in Edmonds. Yeah. Dennis moved right along and the patients missed him, but so be it. So I was not as emotional maybe as you would be on, because it was my second time selling something. But your main question was something else, I think.
Well, just the mindset. So let's get into that. So you sold that first practice. Your mindset was different than the second time. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, the second time I recognized that you are replaceable, and as valuable as you have been in that situation, and as potentially good or bad or indifferent of a business owner that you have been, you are replaceable. And I think that allowed me to take a little bit of the emotion out of, quote unquote, giving my baby. If I've noticed another theme with dentists that are selling, and maybe I've just been only blessed to work with them, all the really great ones and wonderful people, but they are so concerned about their staff. Yeah. They're so concerned that the next dentist has the same benefits, and are they going to have the same vacation? Will they have the same wages? It's really it's a selfless, and I think really unique for this industry, and speaks highly to the dentists out there that are selling, that they care so much about their staff. Well, and of course they care about their patients, but they're going to find a good buyer for their patients. But
we have to
that's another recurring theme.
Cindy, we have to understand this. Staff and salaries, which makes up 20 to 25% of the actual overhead of a practice, right? Sometimes more. Mike is giving me more, but literally that can be a deal breaker. Oh. And a lot of times someone is getting overpaid. And so I understand where these dentists come from, right? I get it. But from an empirical data, I understand there's some brokers out there that love to talk about the new carpet and the new chairs and the bullshit on the walls. I don't care. A true M&A firm focuses on empirical data, which is numbers, right? So someone is going to beat up that seller based upon the fact that their staff wages are too high or their rent is too high. And that's where getting a broker involved, or a lawyer involved, if you're not using a broker, to help hammer out all these details well in advance before the LOI. So that way there's no fighting post LOI and everyone is dancing to the finish line. That's how a true transaction happens in the business world. Unfortunately, in dental land, it doesn't work that way. It's a fight to the end. And that's why a lot of these things actually don't close when they're supposed to. Yeah. Because egos get involved, or my babies get involved, and those expectations aren't taken care of well in advance. So I love the fact that you went through it twice. Both were great experiences. And it sounds like they both transitioned well.
Well, they were great experiences, but they weren't without stress.
Well, exactly. And remember,
I don't want to sugarcoat it too much. It was stressful.
Yeah.
You guys dropped the keys at the closing table, as they say, as opposed to some of these guys that stay on 6, 9, 12 months.
We had to stay on. Part of our closing for the second practice was to stay on for 2 months.
I was picking that up. It sounded like that second time.
But 2 months is different than a year.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? This guy's running his business this way? That's crazy. You know, like I love that you had that transition play because
that's perfect to kind of put a crescendo on this episode. Last question, we could spend some time on it here. Post transition issues. So it's hard to ask you questions, Doc, because you have 2 examples and one of them I didn't even know about. So, and now that I've learned a lot about your 2 transitions, I'm actually interested in the first transition because you just said you stayed on, and actually those have issues too. Now that I think about it, so let's take 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. Let's talk about the first one, issues, because there's always issues post close. And John, you got into the legalese of the whole deal. The whole point of legal, and we're going to get into that. We're going to have Deno Nachos himself, Robert Montgomery, we're going to interview on the legal side of this season, but they try to do everything that they can to make sure that all of the fighting happens during the transition, so that when we're done, that there aren't any issues, and if there are issues, it's already spelled out. That's probably the most simple way to say it. So what issues did you have, or what expectations did you have post-close, first time and second time?
The first time, I think it went well. I think that potentially maybe there wasn't enough of communication with my husband and the new dentist to really help solidify the staff. The new dentist did end up losing quite a bit of the staff over time. And although very successful, still fine and all of that, I think that for me led itself to really wanting to secure the staff for the next transition and really make sure that I did things that I've actually noticed some other dentists do now, but I made sure that when we closed, I actually paid out a bonus to my staff post-close. I actually took them out and paid out a bonus to kind of ensure a goodwill and help them feel good about the position and do some extra things along the way that really tried to help that. And then
hang on 1 second. Hang on. Did you have a bonus program in place already? Or
we had I know people are going to say you're crazy. I had a daily bonus that I did calculate every day, and not every, for each payroll, but I did have a daily bonus. I didn't really have as much of a big thing, but I kind of gave them something really substantial to try to really foster the.
Did you
help the dentist about it?
So that post-close bonus, that's interesting to me. I like that. Was that just something that you had brought up into the transition that you thought would be great for the buyer? Did you leave money on the table there? I mean, what was the thought process?
Well, my thought process was I really wanted to make sure that I got a good jump start for them in a loyalty transfer. So I felt like this was a way for me to say, thank you for everything you've done. I had a really long-term staff. I had a dental assistants for 23 years, hygienists for decades, 3 hygienists with me over a decade. So I really felt like doing that was really saying thank you for every bit of goodwill that you've brought to this practice. And as we all know, and I don't know if all your listeners know, but 80% of what you're selling, because I know we think a lot that it's the physical building, 80% of what you're selling in most situations is goodwill. And so I really wanted to carry that forward. So I think I wouldn't have necessarily done that if I hadn't have maybe felt like it was a little bit of that piece. Like I didn't want people to feel somehow that I abandoned them or left them. And I've noticed actually I've had I've actually had 2 sellers do similar idea on their own. I didn't suggest it. It's not something that a broker is going to suggest to you, but they've done that. And I think it's a helpful, positive thing. So
I'm going to say right now, that's not probably going to happen. Cindy, that is super sweet. And I love that, being on the side of the buyers most of the time. I wish all the sellers would do that. So you did it. Right. You did a Class A deal there. Like that is awesome. That's almost worth a higher price. So sellers out there, consider putting a carrot out there for maybe a higher price point for that. That's huge. So that's great.
Yeah,
that's
it worked
great.
cool. And everyone really stayed on. I mean, they had good something I would recalculate in the future, both my husband and I would recalculate in the future, is that we did stay on as associates for 2 months. And we did not look at the associate agreement very well because we weren't interested in it. It wasn't part of our focus. We were just kind of staying with goodwill. I would encourage people who are staying on, if it's 2 weeks, 2 months, or 6 months, or a year, make sure that you are extremely confident in what you're signing in an associate agreement. And I am very good with that with my sellers. If they are staying on, we just didn't focus on it. I don't think it was anyone's fault. I think it was a sort of standard associate agreement, but it really didn't really work out. It caused a little more back and forth than really probably you need in that situation. So I would just encourage people to really look at their associate agreement and make sure that.
That's Cindy, that is, I always would say
The employment contract is more important than the asset purchase agreement for the actual, especially if they're staying on.
Yep.
So spot on with that. Like that, I would hammer that home so much, because ultimately, especially for $1 million seller, of a practice, right? If they're staying on for 3 to 5 years or whatever that might be, they might make up that dollar amount also in their employment contract on the backside.
Right.
And so understanding the nuances of that from a buy side, sell side of what that looks like, it's really important. But once again, you brought it up earlier, Cindy, you got to make sure the numbers are there, right? Like the numbers have to be there from the buyer's perspective for this practice, whether it's big, small. Even if they want to make sure they retain patients, then they say, we have to have this dentist here. Guess what? Everything's going to be okay. And like you said earlier, Cindy, this happens more often than people understand. Let the people that understand the process help navigate those waters. Cindy, you gave great insight from really both perspectives in my mind. You gave it from obviously the seller's perspective, but, we had that other side that you're that dentist and your husband had to buy into, your practice, and you built something big, and that psyche of what happens to that seller and, that egocentric world that dentists work in. Thank you for it, realizing it and letting others know that that's a reality. But, I always say, it has to be a fair exchange, and people really have to knock out these nuances well in advance of that LOI and that closing date. But you did a great job of helping us understand that from your perspective. We only have our own perspective. Yes, I sold practices. Yes, I sold my own practices. But it's also great having a dentist perspective, and we appreciate you being a part of it.
Thanks for letting me be a part of it. It's been really fun.
Yes, Cindy. Merry Christmas for the background. Yep. Do you live in the North Pole by chance?
I know, right? It's like that. Although the snow all melted, but it was a lot of snow up here for a while.
No, you were great. Exactly right. So thanks again, followers. Tune in next. Well, we're gonna try to drop these every 2 weeks. Follow along Facebook, subscribe to YouTube. We're working our way through the process, and Cindy, you got us going really well here. So thanks so much.
Yeah,
thanks, Cindy.
All right, guys. See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Acquisition Uncensored. The truth when buying and selling a dental practice. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and YouTube. Interact with your hosts, Michael and John.